Welcome to Living in Connection, where we explore the nature of physical and non-physical reality and what that means in your life.
Again, excited to get into this, so thank you for making time.
Thank you for doing it.
Absolutely. So I kind of want to just get right into it today, and I would love to know how this started. If you could touch on, the beginning and what your experience was.
Well, we'll start with the mundane. How's that?
Okay.
I had moved up to what we called the new land, which was by the Monroe Institute. And Rita and her husband were living there already. We didn't meet right away, but in 1998, I met them for the first time. In 2000, her husband, Martin, was in a car crash and he died a couple of days later in the hospital, quite consciously. He chose to die, basically. That afternoon, I was writing in my journal, which is how I usually talk to what I call the guys upstairs, in other words, non-physical personalities. And this is the only time this has happened. Martin came through, and among other things, he said, "Take care of Rita. I know you'll want to. It won't be long." And so I thought, oh, okay. So Rita and I began going out for supper on Saturday nights, and this went on for months. Now, I need to explain. When I met Rita, she was 80 years old. All right, so she's 26 years older than I am. She's a retired professor. She had quite a distinguished career, ending up at the State University of New York. She did Bob Monroe's second Gateway program, and it blew her away. As she said, she thought of herself as a stodgy old professor, and all of a sudden she discovered, as many people do in Gateway, that there were all these unsuspected worlds within her. So she went back to her university and she announced she was going to take early retirement in a year, sent her husband, who had already retired, down there to build a house. And they were there. And then this was some years before I moved up there. Bob Monroe, who is known as the out-of-body man, but really ought to be known, I think, more as the man who found a way to put electronic, to create altered states of mind electronically to facilitate. You can't force them, but if you're willing, you can get them. Well, he set up a consciousness lab where he would put people in an altered state, run the signals through earphones, monitor with three things, electrodes on three fingers, and had come up with a result at the end. As soon as he started the lab, much to Rita's surprise, he gave her the keys and said, "Here, you run it." So he had put together the electronics. He knew how to mix the signals to get various states, but he knew nothing about how to deal with people in the box in any professional way. But Rita was a trained psychologist, so she actually invented the whole protocol for how to deal with people while they're in the box. And she did that for about 4 years, she and her husband both, until she re-retired. And she re-retired about a dozen years before I met her. Okay. This is a little disorganized, but we'll get there eventually. By the time I met Rita, as I said, she was 80 years old, and we would go out. Here she is, she's newly widowed, right? So we would go out and we would have supper every Saturday night. And you can't do that week after week after week without getting below the surface level, and you start to share more than just surface things. You begin to understand each other emotionally and intellectually, and what's interesting to you and what's to you. At the time, I was still working, so we would only do this on the weekends. So in the year 2000, I did a series of 10 sessions in the black box at Monroe, which was much to do. And I did them every Friday, and I typed them all up, which was a massive job. They give you a recording, but typing up a recording is not play. I would send it out to the Voyagers mailing list, and Rita was on that list, so she would see all of the transcripts as they came out. And the more we looked at the transcripts, the more questions she had. because A, she was a trained psychologist. B, she was a professor. C, she was an experiencer herself. And D, she had run the lab and watched all of those people over 4 years.
Wow.
And she would, when they had their own personal agenda taken care of and they had a little extra time, she would say, well, what's it like over there? Or she would ask questions like that and could never get a satisfactory answer.
Mm-hmm.
She had quite a backlog of things that she wanted to know about the universe. Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll cut a little bit to the chase, although it's already too late to do that.
It's good.
In August of 2001, we decided that instead of my going back into the black box and doing some more, I would go over to her house on Tuesday nights after I finished work, I had my supper, and I'd go over there, lie down on her couch, and she had a list of questions, and we had 2 tape recorders. And so she would continue to do the same thing because she said, you don't need the black box. And she was right. By that time, I was used to, as you yourself would know, once you learn the trick of getting into an altered state, it's not difficult. It's just you go back where it was. Well, we started 5 weeks before September 11th of 2001. And one of our sessions was on that 5th session, which was kind of memorable, But we went on for like 22 weeks at least. I eventually typed all that up, another massive job, right? And Rita and I both wrote introductions. I was going to put it into a book, but I didn't get it. I was trying to do it logically rather than sequentially, and I never was able to do that. So Rita finally died in 2008 without that book having been published yet, although I did have her introduction at mine too. I thought that was the end of our collaboration. And about 6 years later, I woke up from a dream, and I don't remember the detail of the dream, but I remember the idea was, okay, it's time to get back to work. So the next morning, let me pause here. The way I talk to the guys, or the way I talk to anybody when I'm in an altered state, I use a journal, pen and journal. I write it all out longhand. It's a little bit laborious, but the guys have said that actually helps because it slows me down. My mind is very quick, and sometimes if it's very quick, it stays on the surface. And if you have to slow down a little bit, you get a little better, you get a little deeper. Okay.
I see.
So I was there the next morning, and for the next 6 months, Rita and I went through, and my friend Bob Friedman published it in 2 volumes.
Amazing.
Stuff. Yeah. And then I thought we were done again. And of course, after a while, about 6 months later, did it again and again. So there was the one huge tome, The Sphere and the Hologram, which was the one when Rita was in body. And then there were the 4 books after she was finished. And then people kept saying, well, will there be any more? And I was like, oh.
Ask Rita.
We were going to get to them. Is that more than you wanted to know about me and Rita?
No, that's amazing. Wow. Okay. So I'm sure she told you a lot of amazing information throughout that process, because I, like most people, am very curious about what happens after we pass on. I have a lot of my own questions, and I would probably share sort of that similarity with Rita, where I just have a natural curiosity about it. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions that I'm curious about. And the first one being, I have heard that we have a life review, and I'm so curious if Rita touched on that and what that experience is like.
Okay. Let me say that the 3rd Rita book, which I called Awakening from the 3D World, is not about her near-death experience. This is after she's been through the whole death experience. And she remembered the questions she had while she was alive. She remembered the questions that I had in our discussions about it.
It's amazing.
Now she came through and gave the answers from her experience to those questions.
Wow.
And they are, I'll tell you what, none of it is simple. None of it is simplistic either, if you know the distinction between the 2 words. And Rita says, and the guys have told us this many times before, a lot of the reports that we get from the other side, like from someone who has a near-death experience and comes back, a lot of it gets a little bit twisted because it happens in non-3D space, and we have to sort of force it into 3D circumstances, which means logic and sequence. And it didn't exactly happen in logic and sequence, but there's no other way for our 3D part of our mind to make sense of it. So we
Yeah.
do. And I've heard people talk about their experience, and they get, I don't understand how this could be happening at the same time, but it did somehow. And you see that's part of the process.
Yes.
Rita did have well, all right, now this segues into something that might be more interesting even.
Okay.
She did have the past life review, if you want to look at it that way. But another way of looking at it is when you drop the body, you drop the barriers between your mind and your 3D mind, your the consciousness we live in while we're in the 3D. And so a lot of that stuff becomes immediately evident to you. But you don't need to say, okay, 1946, 47, 48, 49. It's all there. The pattern is there. So you see your life's pattern more as a gestalt than as a sequence. Okay. You see how that might be.
Right.
But when you come home, that is to say, if you're still alive and you're explaining what just happened to you, it's very difficult. Not that you're trying to lie to people, but it's hard to get it straight in your own head. You had this and you had this, but how did they connect? And what was it? I don't remember the sequence. Well, maybe there wasn't a sequence, but our 3D mind kind of insists that there had to have been a sequence. So we do the best we can to make sense of it. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time, because I know what's happening with the guys upstairs now. I used to wonder, because they'll go all around Robin Hood's barn to explain the simple thing, but they're always giving you context, and one thing always leads to another thing.
Right. Yeah.
So,
okay. So how about, I'm also curious, something I was going to ask you is just what really stood out. I mean, that's a lot of material that you have written with her. Is there any sort of important message or anything that really stood out that she told you?
you're thinking in terms of information, I think. And I would say what really stood out was and it always stands out to me, the ease of communication with somebody that you're in resonance with, and the depth of information that you can get sort of between the lines. Much of what she said, I think of the books we've done together, I think the one that is in some ways my favorite is Awakening from the 3D World, because it was very much focused on just that question. You die, what happens? Well,
what happens?
Yeah, for one thing, you lose touch of your senses, right? So all of a sudden, you can't, whether it's all of a sudden or gradually, you can't experience the world the way you always did. You're still there, you're in the middle of things, but now you have no senses. Now what? And then she explained it at some length, and then it's really fascinating. Things open up, now you start being suffused with memories, and you look at your life and you start seeing your life in different patterns. You see all the connections that you didn't see in lifetime. So you had an altercation with somebody 15 years ago. You can now only see your point of view and their point of view, but you can see a sort of what you might call a summary point of view. You can see all the ramifications that went off in their life, in your life, in the life either one of you connected. And what you wind up seeing is there's no end to the spider's web. Everything connects with everything else. And it isn't obvious to us because we're in one small body, and the whole purpose of 3D is to make us experience one time in one place at a time. So but the non-3D is not like that. The non-3D can take this huge sweeping view and say, well, see, this is how it's going on. So when we
everything
began
all at once.
Well, yes, and it's funny, because our own brains are like that anyway. Half of our brain is gestalt and the other half is logic. The half of our brain that deals with words has to be sequential, because that's how words are. One word, next word, next word, next word. There's no other way to do it, right? But if you're in a dream state, say, or an altered state, or in a coma or anything else, you might get visions. You might get knowings. You might get all what some people call altered state experiences. A lot of times that does not come with words because it's not sequential, and you can get an image, particularly if you're doing dream work. You get an image, and that image has stuff packed in it, and it's up to you to sort of unpack the image, and it can put things together in a way they could never do logically. you know.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I have a follow-up question to that. So it sounds like, okay, this is coming from someone who has experience being out of the body, not a lot, just a couple times, and I felt like I still had a body.
Mhm.
So do we still feel like, do we still have sort of like an energy body, or what is that?
Well, while you're in the body, I mean, while you're alive, you don't actually go anywhere. You don't go out of the body, but your
Oh,
awareness, your consciousness changes its focus. So,
okay.
you know what? I should have made some. Let me try here. I'll make a little sketch. Okay.
Okay.
Um, this isn't going to be very good, but here's the person. That's us. That's the part that
Huh.
we identify with, in 3D. But all of the rest of this is us too. But it's in the non-3D.
Mm,
Not even shaped. I mean, as far as we are concerned, but it's there. It's part of us. This is what we
right.
experience. This is our unconscious mind. These are all the other parts of ourselves that we're not aware of. Well,
Okay.
when you die and the barrier drops, now you're aware that, oh, I'm way more than I thought I was. And I'm different than I thought I was. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if you have known people to contact people that they were uh, intimately connected with after the person died.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll say, well, it was like that person, but not quite like it. And I would say
Mm-hmm.
that's because they still had the signature of the life they just finished leading, but there was also all the rest of them that had never really necessarily showed, and
Okay.
now you're
Yeah.
seeing they're sort of reintegrating. I mean, you could
Right.
look at our life as deliberate. I've never said this before, but I think it's true. You could look at our life as deliberate dissociation. This little self here in the 3D, taken one moment at a time, is deliberately dissociated temporarily from all the rest of it. Now, the rest of it
Mm-hmm.
exists and the rest of it knows it, but it doesn't know the larger self, except if it does the proper things, meditation, the various ways that we get to learn that we're more than just 3D consciousness. But
Right.
we're way more mysterious than that, and we're way more interconnected. It really seems to be true that we're all one thing.
Yeah.
You,
Yes.
you have to understand too that all the stuff that Rita and I talked about after she died was informed by all the material we had gotten from the guys upstairs over several years, and they put out a very coherent scheme of life. And if I had to put that in a word, they'd say you're here in life to choose and choose
Mm.
and choose. You have certain values. You have embodied certain values by just the strands that came together when you were born. Now, every moment of your life is this the value I want to uphold, or do I want to change it, or do I want to oppose it? And some of your strands, they look at us as like a bundle. Some of the
Right.
strands may be opposed to other strands. They may have opposing values. And
Mm.
in that case, it's up to you in the 3D to say, well, I'm the one in the body. I want to be always forgiving, or I want to alternate between being forgiving and being vindictive, or I always want to be on top. I mean, there's a million variations of what you can do. And to maybe
Absolutely.
tomorrow you change and you're not like you were before at all. They said, well, I don't know what
Right.
came over me. I was beside myself. Well, you picked a different bundle to identify with it then.
Yeah. So when we transition to the other side, to the afterlife,
Yeah.
um, are we are we taking those choices with us then? Do we remain sort of this identity plus more, or do
Yes.
we shed a lot?
No, no, you're right in the first place. And in fact, when Rita and I were first talking to them back in 2001, and we were still a lot at sea, because the stuff we were getting is not the stuff you ordinarily read about in metaphysical material. But they called us. They said to us, we look more like habit systems. Oh yeah, what?
Oh,
And gradually over several years, we realized what they meant is you have the habit of being this. You have inculcated the habit of doing and being and feeling and valuing this, as opposed to other things you could have done. So at the end, you have created um, the difficulty here is all words are misleading, but you'll have to give it a little slack. in a sense, you can say we spend our life creating who we're going to be.
Right.
When we have created that ball of habit systems, and it's in the non 3D, we have actually added to what the world had. There's something new in the world. And this happens
Hmm.
every time somebody dies. It doesn't actually happen when you die, it happens during your life. But it's easier to think of it as, okay, you're done. Now you're part of the human library, and the
Yes.
library keeps getting new volumes.
Right.
And the shelving must be a real problem, but they don't.
Right. So does any of this information with Rita or experience with Rita suggest that we continue evolving
Oh, yes.
after death?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's never been a sense of any kind of a dead end in it.
Yeah.
But there is this. People who believe in reincarnation often believe, I don't know if everybody does, but they often believe in a unit that then reincarnates as a new unit.
Yes.
And the guys weren't really giving us that. They gave us more like they had me paint it once, and it was very good. I can't, of course, do it now, but I'm going to give you a sense of it. I don't know if you can see those are lines in a couple of circles.
Mm-hmm.
If you've regarded these lines as threads, this could be a
Mm-hmm.
thread of a certain kind of a person's, maybe this is a spiritual person, maybe a violent person, maybe this is a creative person. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that spirituality goes and is part of this ring, so it's part of that person, but it goes on and it's part of other rings as well. Now, this particular ring has the spirituality and the violence. So maybe you get a religious fanatic, or
Yeah.
this one may have violence and I say creativity. So maybe you get, I don't know what you get, but the point of it is that we are all not units. In fact,
Right.
you might enjoy this. Rita got in trouble with her very first question of the guys the very first night. She wanted to know how many people we were talking to. And they basically said, that question doesn't make any sense. Oh, what? And they said, not only are we not as individual as you think we are, you are not as individual as you think you are. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when they began. And it took a long while because it's a pretty different concept to show us a picture of ourselves as a collection of various strands operating together, cohabiting in
Yeah.
the same body, learning to deal with each other.
Great.
Parenthetically, they said that's one reason why you can never judge anybody else's life. You don't know if they had a successful life or not. They said, supposing you had somebody who had two tendencies that he was reconciling that hated each other, and it took all of his strength and all of his will just to live. He might be a
Mm-hmm.
drunk and he dies in the gutter, and everybody would say, well, that was a failure. And yet, actually, from a larger point of view, it might have been a success. He was able to do a very difficult thing. How would we ever
Yeah.
know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you talk about the threads, it reminds me of parts work in therapy, where a therapist will have you, focus on yourself as a child at some point, or um, maybe like a negative aspect or doubt that comes through, and it treats it all as a part of the whole.
Mhm.
And in this case, are you saying that it's almost like each thread is alive in itself?
In a way, you could say that each thread could be considered to be what most people call past lives,
Okay.
except it's not really past. From our 3D point of view, that's how it looks. So
Hmm.
one of my major threads is a monk, a Norman monk in England in the 1200s. Major influence on me. Another one is a Welsh journalist, okay, in the 1800s.
Hmm.
Now, from a 3D point of view, both of those are dead. I mean, they're dead. They were
Right.
born, they lived, and they're died. But from a non 3D point of view, all moments of time always exist. They've
Hmm.
existed from the beginning, and they always will exist. It isn't like we're hopping from one iceberg to the other to get across the river. Like, boy, I got away from that last moment just in time because it dissolved, and now it's now. That
Yes.
isn't the way it works. I mean, that's how it seems to us. That's what common sense would say. That was a moment like when we began this. That's past now. We can't go back there. And so to us, it's as if it's destroyed. It's gone.
Yeah.
Outside of time and space, every moment is the same as every other moment. They're still there. So it's then boy, you can go on and on with the ramifications of that. The more you think about it.
Right. So the veil is really us. this body, it seems.
I would say it's a necessary, I was going to say a necessary evil. I don't know that it's even evil, but it's a necessary condition for us to be able to function at one time in one place, at least at the beginning. You know, when you're a baby and you're coming, although even as I'm saying that, some children apparently remember other lifetimes and right from the beginning, you know.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but in any case, there has to be some kind of a veil to prevent us from being overwhelmed. If the moment you were here, you remembered everything you were, all the various kinds of people that you were, all the things
Yeah.
that happened to them, all the, you couldn't. I don't think you could live. I mean, I don't see how you could. It would be too much. You can learn
Definitely.
though, and I'm sure that you've had that experience. I know many people in
Yes.
Monroe have that experience, and you can learn to gradually open up your. I guess really, what you're doing is you're expanding your ideas. You're expanding your ideas of what's possible, and when you do
Mm.
that, then you can sort of make sense of it. Although everything the guys have told us, sometimes quite in some amusement over the years, is that they talk to us and they tell us things, and we ask questions, and they have to decide: are we going to address all the misconceptions in that question, or are we going to try to answer?
Or just try to give them an answer they can sort of make sense of.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I think their continuing task is give them enough that they can deal with it. Don't give them more
Yeah.
than they can deal with, because what good is it? And don't give them less than they can deal with, because you're wasting time. But uh,
Well,
for fun and
so
for aggravation.
yeah, yeah. A lot of people talk about this reality being sort of like a school. Does that sort of match up with what they're saying or what Rita has said, or is that just not it at all?
No, I don't like it much, and I don't think the guys like it much as an analogy. It's more like workshop, exercise yard, uh,
Mm.
career path. I mean, we're here not so we can go home and say, I learned more than you did. But we're here so that we can say, this is what I am. These are the beliefs that I value. These are the,
Okay.
you know, and that's not so much schooling. That's more like it's a choice as to what you're going to be. And it appears, I don't really know what's going on the other side, but it appears like there's a continuing, maybe call it a tug of war between values. And it's and this is funny to talk about a place where there's no time and to say sometimes one value predominates. Okay, thank you. Now there was an example. I just got a little download there, and it reminded me that astrology is a way of portraying the differences in time. And one moment of time is not the same as another moment of time. Some things can be done in one moment that can't be done in another moment, or it couldn't have been done 15 years ago, that kind of thing. So, when people talk about the veil thinning, I think that's an
Yeah.
example of it. It's easier for us to do things like talk to the guys upstairs just offhand, and it would have been almost impossible in Yeats's time 100 years ago. I mean, he worked at it really, really hard, the poet. He worked very hard at doing these things. He and his uncle worked magic and things, but it wasn't easy. Had he been alive today, or were he alive today, he would be able to do much more with the training that he gave himself then.
So why is it that the veil feels like it's thinning or that people are saying that?
Well, I think the time has come around, Faith, for us to go to the next phase. It's clear that our present civilization has been dying for,
Mm.
maybe dying is too dramatic a way, but it is fading. It's been fading for at least since 1914, when World War I started, and which destroyed European dominance. But it's been fading for quite a while, and it's not a tragedy. You have one form of civilization, and it expresses like a flower, and at some point the flower fades and you get a new kind of flower. So that
Mm.
you had the Middle Ages, and they had their own beauty. Then they faded, and then it was the Renaissance. The Renaissance was beautiful and terrible. And then you went to modern times. Now we're in postmodern times. You can see, if you ever get to be as old as I am already, you will be living in a world where the Chinese and the Indians and presumably the Muslims have way more influence on world affairs than they've ever had in my lifetime. And correspondingly, the Europeans and the Americans presumably will have less. It doesn't mean it's a tragedy, and it doesn't mean it's a great, wonderful thing either. It means it's another flower. Just as each of us may be looked at as a flower that we're creating, so is the civilization. So I asked the guys several years ago, I guess when I was doing the black box sessions with Skip Atwater, and asked what was coming next. And they said the next step for humans in general will be that people will be walking around in bodies knowing that they're more than their body, not believing, but knowing, experiencing. Step after that we'll never see it. It'll be a long time, presumably. But the step after that is everybody will walk around knowing not only that, but that we're all one thing and that we're all part of one thing. Now, you can see those are going to be indescribably different from anything we experienced. But it may be that you and Dirk and I and all of our cohort have come in to be a part of the change, to do whatever we can do to ease people away and say, look, don't feel like you're trapped here. There are things going on, and you can help make the transition,
Yeah, I do. I'm curious what the guys upstairs or what Rita or anyone you've worked with says about coming in with like sort of a mission or a plan, just like that. Like you hear about raising the vibration or raising the consciousness. Is there anything there?
Parenthetically, let me say, probably not this time because I guess we're about out of time, but if you want, we can try to, and I'll talk to the guys or I'll talk to Rita in response to your question. I'll have them talk to you directly. Now,
love that.
it's always a guess because maybe they won't be there. Someday I'll knock on the door and they're going to say, sorry, we moved. but I'm willing to do that as an experiment anytime.
Yeah, great.
But your question is a little long for this time, though, I think.
Understood. Yeah. Well, let's get back to more of the Rita material and your experience with that. Let's see. I'm really curious if she mentioned anything that sort of surprised her after she transitioned, or there was anything that was different than maybe she was expecting.
Very good question. I may need to think about that. Nothing comes to mind offhand, which is not the same thing as saying there wasn't anything.
Of course.
The opposite of a surprise. I think she got what it was she always hoped, that she thought would be too good to be true. She said her idea of bliss would be an eternal research project without ever having to write up papers.
I love that.
Me, it would be just the opposite. I like writing the papers and the researchers' work, but that's what she wanted. And
I'm with Rita on that.
Now, I haven't actually had a conversation with Rita for probably, I don't know, I lost track of the time, but it was 6 years or so. So it would be interesting. I'm sure she would be there. And depending on your question, we'll see what kind of an answer we get.
Okay.
I don't want that to have a side benefit. The main thing I'm here for, as far as I can tell, is by example to tell everybody, look, if I can do this, you can do this. It isn't difficult. The biggest problems are usually ones people make in their own mind. They have assumptions. Well, I did this from ground zero and I made every possible mistake that I can think of in terms of getting it wrong and trying it wrong. But as I said to you one time, that has its good aspects too, because then you're on solid ground. You know what didn't work. Now you know what does work.
Of course.
People have said, well, do you think you're psychic? And I said, you couldn't be in the body if you weren't psychic. It's a part of being in the body. You couldn't do it.
Yeah.
When you put it in those terms, then instead of people thinking, I'd have to be a special person, I'd have to have a special gift, then it becomes, oh, maybe I can figure out how to do it. And that's a big leap right there, because it, as you know, it isn't difficult, but it is a knack.
Right. Yeah, I feel like it's so important for people to realize that too. So that's an important thing to work on and just make people more aware of in general. Because I totally agree. It's like I always say, we're all spirits. It's just we have this body with us. That's the difference. But so let's see. Yeah, go ahead.
The guys once said, we have an expression which they don't like much and they wish we had the opposite. The expression we have is too good to be true. And they said, it's too bad we don't also have an expression that says too bad to be true. In other words, life is much more hopeful and much more open than we sometimes think. Sometimes we go, and in fact, you've never done a Monroe program, but they alternate between going and doing a session in an altered state session using headphones, and then come down together, debrief. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 50 times, somebody coming down and saying, well, I'm probably just making this up. And every time I've heard that, I've done, okay, here comes a real experience, because they know they don't know what it means and it came out of the blue. Yeah, but
Absolutely.
and I like that they don't know what it is. Sometimes it's important to be naive, beginner's mind. See what it is first before you judge it.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
You and I can talk for 100 hours easily, I'm sure.
Yeah, I know. The time is already going so fast.
Well, once in a while, I'll even give you a chance to say something.
Oh, good. I can't believe we're already at almost 40 minutes now.
I can go on, but I think people will get tired.
Yeah. Well, why don't we wrap it up? But are there any last thoughts or anything like that you'd like to end with?
Well, let's go back next time and do some more with Rita. Maybe see if Rita's there to talk. But if not, there's plenty to talk about what she has done.
Yes, okay. I would love that. That'd be great.
And again, I thank you and Dirk for doing this. I couldn't do it by myself, and I think it's very valuable.
Oh, thank you.
Great job, guys. And it is a good start into the discussion, because there is so much more in the Rita work that is just amazing. I think the one comment I would add to it is my own experience of how to connect with the world beyond, if you will, was less about trying to develop the skill and more about remembering, because it's where we started.
Well, I remember you learning to talk to the guy in my living room.
Yeah, what Frank's referring to is doing his intuitive link communication. It's an experience in its own right, because it's not channeling really, but something like that. And so he had me do that, and there were a couple of hallmarks to it that were amazing. One was I was speaking faster than I could understand what I was saying. And I already talked fast to begin with, so that was a little bit wild. But then when the message came through from the guys and they're telling me something and they're talking about me, they talked about me using my name.
And you're having to say it. And
I'm having to say my own name where I'm the third person. It's like, wait a minute, that was just really hard to do. But then once you finally get past that, things get a lot easier.
It was hard for you to do for about a minute, and then you got it.
It's mostly just shut up, sit down, and say. Let the mouth do whatever they want them to do with it. Yeah. It's very interesting. Anyway, great job. Anything, closing thoughts we should share with everybody?
Just, you know what? I wonder if it would be worth our while to invite people to ask us questions, because maybe they'll
absolutely
just topics we wouldn't think of.
Anyway, have a great afternoon, and thank you very much. And we'll continue with the next in the series.
Excellent. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please press like. Please press subscribe to stay informed of new episodes as they appear. We would love to hear from you in the comments section below, and we wish you the very best in connecting with your own guidance.